Module 2, the Global Business Method. The Global Business Method is an international business method for digital trade transactions that is defined by globally recognized trade documents and URDT digital rules. The manual was first published in 1999 and updated for the URDTT in October 2021. The Global Business Method Manual, listing the processes to be used by buyers and sellers globally to conduct online trade transactions using the ICC Uniform Rules for Digital Trade Transactions, published 1 October 2021, and the ICC Uniform Customs and Practice for Documentary Credits for Electronic Presentation, published July 1, 2019. The Global Business Method begins with a buyer's request for quotation and ends with the seller's transfer of goods and title for payment. The Global Business Method follows International Chamber of Commerce rules and guidelines for digital trade transactions. The Global Business Method contains the following. Method. The Global Business Method provides for a common business method from request for quotation to final payment and title transfer of goods. Documents. The GBM provides buyer and sellers with trade transaction document templates. E-rules. The GBM follows the URDT rules and EUCP guidelines. Management. The GBM manages online transaction and digital trade payment facilities with UCP guidelines. Each step in a typical trade transaction is represented by a generic trade transaction document. The process begins with a request for quotation from a buyer to a seller, then a quotation from a seller, then a purchase order from the buyer to the seller that is agreed to by the seller. This is acknowledged by the seller with a purchase order acknowledgement. The next step is for the seller to prepare a pro forma invoice that includes logistics costs based on the Incoterm agreed to. The buyer has issued a digital trade payment facility representing the total amount of the transaction that he is obligated to pay when the transport documents are presented for payment. The GBM digital trade documents contain checklists for information that needs to be determined and accumulated between the buyer and seller for a successful transaction. There are 3 checklists. The first is a trade transaction checklist defining the transaction itself. The second is the payment method checklist defining the terms and conditions. And finally, the terms and condition checklist, which contains the documents for payment. There are 2 payment methods in the model. The first transaction payment is a checklist for the digital trade payment, URDT, Uniform Rules for Digital Trade Transactions and Payment Schedule. The second method is a EUCP documentary letter of credit. This is the Uniform Customs and Practice for Documentary Credits for Electronic Presentation, better known as the EUCP, version 2.0, and its payment method. The payment terms and conditions checklist includes the buyer, who is the obligor, who is the seller, who is the financial service provider, a general description of the goods, a detailed description of the goods, the logistics company for the buyer, the logistics company for the seller, the currency to be exchanged, the total cost, including freight and fees. The drafts are payable at site or someday within 180 days. No red clauses are allowed in a digital transaction. The checklist also includes the amount and quantity tolerance for that shipment. The mode agreed to, sea, air, rail, truck, or courier. The packaging description, bulk, container, or deck cargo. The Incoterm agreed to and its location. The port or airport of embarkation, the port or airport of debarkation, whether partial shipments are allowed, whether transshipments are allowed, what delivery schedule is agreed to, What quality specifications are required? What is the period of presentation, the number of days allowed to prepare documents after shipment? And are any third-party documents allowed? And finally, the transport documents need to be required and sent digital documents sent to the buyer or its designee, and the paper originals if it's a C shipment and we're there to go. The documents required for negotiation are referred to as a negotiable document set. These include the bill of lading and whether it's freight prepaid or freight collect, who the bill of lading or transport document is consigned to, who's the notified party when it arrives at the point of shipment, whether it's a railway bill, whether it's shipped on a forwarder's receipt from the warehouse, whether it's a courier receipt, is there a packing list required? Is there an invoice required? Is there a trade bill of exchange required? Who is the payment obligation? Who is the payment for? Who is the financial service provider, if there is one? Do you need an inspection certificate? Is a certificate of origin required? Is there a certificate of insurance required for at least 100% of the shipment value? Is a fumigation certificate required? And on to sanitary certificate and any agreed to reports outside of the standard. And finally, a notice of completeness, which acts as a cover letter for the documents that are being sent electronically to the buyer. Incoterms. There are 11 Incoterms, and the rules for any mode of transportation include Ex Works, FCA, free carrier, CPT, carriage paid to, CIP, carriage and insurance paid to, DPU, delivered at place unloaded, DAP, delivered at place, and finally DDP, delivered duty paid. These Incoterms can be used with any of the 5 modes of transportation. This graphic illustrates the Incoterms concept of adding more cost burden to the seller as the goods move from the seller's warehouse to the warehouse of the buyer. Ex Works on the left is the least costly to the seller with no carriage, freight, terminal fees, export tariff, or insurance to pay. The most costly to the seller is DDP, delivered duty paid, when the seller is responsible for all the logistics costs and duty fees incurred. Allocations of costs to the buyer or seller, according to Incoterm 2020, is this graphic. This is a detailed chart showing the responsibilities incurred by the buyer and the seller for each Incoterm. It also shows that the selection of the Incoterm should not be taken lightly. It should definitely be decided before the final price is quoted. Rules for any mode of transportation. Ex Works. Ex Works must name the place of delivery. Ex Works means that a buyer incurs the risk of bringing the goods to their final destination. Either the seller does not load the goods on collecting vehicles and does not clear them for export, or if the seller does load the goods, they do so at the buyer's risk and cost. FCA. FCA is free carrier, named place of delivery. FCA, free carrier. The seller delivers the goods cleared for export at a named place, including the seller's own premises. The goods can be delivered to a carrier nominated by the buyer or to another party nominated by the buyer. CPT. CPT, carriage paid to a named place of destination. The seller pays for the carriage of the goods up to the named place of destination. However, the goods are considered to be delivered when the goods have been handed over to the first or main carrier, so that the risk transfers to the buyer upon handling goods over to that carrier at the place of the shipment in the country of export. CIP. CIP, carriage and insurance paid to named place of destination. CIP requires the seller to insure the goods for 110% of the contract value. The policy should be in the name of the currency as the contract and should allow the buyer and seller and anyone else with a insurable interest in the goods to be able to make a claim. DPU. DPU, delivered at place, unloaded, name, place of destination. The Incoterm requires that the seller delivers the goods, unloaded, at the name, place of destination. The seller covers all the costs of transport except fees for carriage, unloading from the main carrier at destination port and destination port charges, and assumes all risk until the arrival at the destination port or terminal. DAP. DAP, delivered at place. The seller delivers the goods are placed at the disposal of the buyer on the arriving means of transport, ready for unloading at the named place of destination. Under DAP terms, the risk passes from the seller to the buyer from the point of destination mentioned in the contract for delivery. DDP, delivered, duty paid, named place of destination. The seller is responsible for delivering goods to the named place in the country of the buyer and pays all the costs in bringing the goods to the destination, including import duties and taxes. The seller is not responsible for unloading. This term places the maximum obligations on the seller and the minimum obligations on the buyer. No risk or responsibility is transferred to the buyer until delivery of the goods at the named place of destination. FAS. These are the rules for sea and inland waterway transport. The first of which is FAS, free alongside shipped, name, port of shipment. The seller delivers the goods are placed alongside the buyer's vessel at the named port of shipment. This means that the buyer has to bear all costs and risk of loss or damage to the goods from that moment. The FAS term requires the seller to clear the goods for export, which is a reversal from the previous Incoterm version that required the buyer to arrange for export clearance. This term should be used only for non-containerized sea freight and inland waterway transport. FOB. FOB, free on board, named port of shipment. Free on board, under the FOB terms, the seller bears all the costs and risks up to the point the goods are loaded on board the vessel. FOB contract requires a seller to deliver the goods on board a vessel that is to be designated by the buyer in a manner customary at that particular port. In this case, the seller must also arrange for export clearance. On the other hand, the buyer pays the cost of marine and freight transportation, bill of lading fees, insurance, unloading, and transportation costs from the arrival port to destination. CFR, cost and freight, named port of destination. The seller pays for the carriage of goods up to the named port of destination. Risk transfers to buyers when the goods have been loaded on board the ship in the country of export. The seller is responsible for origin costs, including export clearance and freight costs for carriage to the named port. The shipper is not responsible for delivery to the final destination from the port, generally the buyer's facilities, or for the buying of insurance. CFR should only be used for non-containerized sea freight and inland waterway transport. All other modes of transport should be replaced with CPT. CIF. CIF is broadly similar to the term CFR, with the exception that the seller is required to obtain insurance for the goods while in transit. CIF requires the seller to insure the goods for 110% of the contract value. The policy should be in the same currency as the contract. The seller must also turn over documents necessary to obtain goods from the carrier. The documents include the invoice, insurance policy, and the bill of lading. These three documents represent the cost, insurance, and freight of CIF. The seller's obligation ends when the transport documents are handed over to the buyer. Another point to consider is that CIF should only be used for non-containerized sea freight, for all other modes of transport should be replaced with CIP. The global business model document templates conform to the universally recognized uniform rules for digital trade transactions. ICC publication number KS102E, which is better referred to as the URDTT, and the Uniform Customs and Practice for Documentary Credits, ICC publication UCP 600, Supplement 2 for documents being presented in electronic format. The global business method, digital trade documents, relate to movement, value, content, quality, suffice as originals from trade finance negotiations with a company or commercial bank.